All right, Rudy. So, as you know, I have been taking Ethnic Studies 121. I know you're always asking me questions about it. So, we're going to discuss the course statement. And the course statement is the presence of the single story, social theories, and white privilege still marginalize ethnic minorities in the US. Yet, this course challenged such systems of domination by promoting a more comparative and empathetic story of the US. So just based off of that, like, do you know what the single story, social theories, and white privilege are?
No.
You don't know what like any of them are?
Yeah, well, yeah, I have an idea of all of them.
Okay. Well, so let me just explain to you a little bit. So the single story um, is basically any story told from a single perspective, and we can say that it's like like the dominant perspective. So it can be applied to history and it can be applied to contemporary events. It doesn't necessarily mean white, but just like any perspective, like the dominant perspective. So for example, in terms of history, the single story can be explained sort of like how like in our history books and stuff, the pilgrims like they discovered America and they came and like they tamed like the savage Indians. Like that's the single story. Like we don't get to hear about it from the perspective of the Native Americans who had been here for generations before. Like we're not taught what was going on here before.
Hmm.
We're taught the single story. And in terms of like contemporary things, the single story could be like the way Fox News depicts like the Black Lives Matter movement participants as like these cop killing individuals, like angry people, and that's not the case. Or even, and I don't want to say that the single story is just the white perspective because that's not true. It's just the dominant perspective. Like what do you think of when I ask you to describe like an African child? Like what do you picture? What comes to mind right away?
An African child,
Mm-hmm.
like a starving kid in Africa.
Exactly. That's the single story. But because we're not exposed to anything else about Africa, like they live pretty normal lives in like most of the country, but we're not it's like being here. Like it's the same thing, but because the news always just shows us that image and National Geographic, like that's what we think of. That's the single story. We're not told anything else.
Hmm.
So it's just like a very narrow-minded perspective, just the like most narrow, dominant perspective about anything, about history or about like contemporary events. And then the social theories, social theories, I think they're just sort of like sociological observations based on like the way people behave. So like an example would be like the scapegoating theory. Like there's plenty, but they're basically just like observations on the way people behave. Like it explains the rationale behind their motives. Like there's like social filters and stuff. Um, so yeah, so have you heard of like the scapegoating theory and stuff? No. Well, yeah, there's plenty,
Oh,
but
that's like the blaming
yeah, they're
someone.
just yeah. So
Yeah,
social theories are just like observations about based on how people behave.
yeah.
And then white privilege, have you heard?
Yes.
You're familiar with it?
Hmm.
Yeah. But white privilege doesn't necessarily just mean like the material like oh they don't get pulled over by cops, but it's pretty like it's dense. It's like all encompassing. And so how do you like now that you kind of have an idea of what it is? How do you think that they marginalize ethnic minorities in the U.S.?
Like, how do they separate minorities from?
Yeah, like how do they make minorities feel excluded?
Well, I mean, the word. I mean, I don't know. I feel like uh, already saying words like dominant and privilege is already excluding. I mean, the word minority alone excludes people from basic uh, perspectives. It's like when you call someone a minority, you're already painting a picture of a certain kind of person or a certain person that maybe is not a good person just by saying minority.
Mm-hmm.
That word's already been kind of I don't want to say watered down, but it's kind of actually the opposite. It's been built up to be this bad thing when in reality it's really just a description of someone's of it's just really like a word that was supposed to mean like a small group is now known as, it's kind of been built up to be,
Non-white.
yeah, non-white, or almost uh non, like they don't give anything back to us, like non-contributing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm glad you said that because the single story I think is huge in marginalizing ethnic minorities because, well, let's just put it in terms of history. Like the single story, I mean, when I was in school, like textbooks were not great, with that. And I think, I mean, I'm Mexican American, but like any minority who does not see themselves reflected in history is going to already develop a mentality where like, well, it's these people, that are included in here, and then it's us, then it's me, and I'm not in here, so I obviously don't have anything to contribute, or I'm not part of this society, it makes them feel excluded. And yeah, like we read this article by Dr. Takaki, and he called history a mirror, and he said that not seeing yourself in history is like looking into a mirror and seeing nothing. And he says that it's a disorienting experience. And it is because it has a huge effect on your mentality. Like, if you don't see yourself reflected in everyday media and you don't see yourself reflected in history, then you feel, it really creates this feeling of like us versus them, like it creates like, oh, well, then it's the white people and then it's us,
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be like entirely about race. It can be gender, it can be, like weight, anything, like if a larger person does not see themselves on magazine covers, and they're obviously going to feel like they're not a contributing member of society, like they're not a valuable member of society,
Well, that's different. I think that's more self-esteem.
Yeah, it affects self-esteem and it lowers it, and so that's what I mean. It has a huge effect on your
Well,
mentality.
the difference with weight is you can change it.
Well,
You
understand what I'm saying.
You can't make yourself, a black guy can't make himself white.
What
just
about
because.
Michael Jackson? I'm just kidding. It's a joke. But yeah, so then it just, like it creates sort of like this internalized depression if you don't see people like you or yourself reflected in society,
Then usually depression turns into rage.
Or even if you do see yourself, but if you see yourself in terms of a single story, like if if someone from Africa comes to the U.S. and they realize that the only image that Americans have been presented with of Africa is the starving child with the bloated belly, how is that going to make them feel? It makes them feel inferior. It makes them feel smaller because these people are just not aware. Like all they've been told and exposed to is a single story. So that's how it edges out minorities, I feel. And then social filters. How do you think?
Social filters.
Yeah. We talked about scapegoating.
Oh.
Do you like social distance? There's plenty.
Social distance.
Social distance. It's just like the distance between groups. Just distance. Like we live in the valley. We're not used to mingling with like
different
white
ethnicities.
Americans. Yeah. Like,
yeah.
It's just there's just distance between your groups.
Yeah.
Or there's like a categoric knowing where you place like you have a prejudgment of others based on like one thing about them. I think I explained this to you about how, like, if you date someone who, loves pink or something, and then they break your heart, so then you think that everybody that likes pink is just a jerk,
exactly. Yeah, like when someone gets robbed by a black guy or by a Mexican, and they think every time they see that a person of that ethnicity, they'll be like, oh,
that's a criminal.
That's a criminal,
Yeah. So how do you think that they marginalize ethnic minorities?
Well, I mean, that's just based on the individual, whether how, I think it's an excuse to project your hate. And I think also it's just it's really boiled down to the individual, how they want to see it. Like, for example, my brother dated a girl who was into punk rock. Until this day, 10 years later, he hates women and men who are into punk rock. He just hates it. and like he absolutely hates it. And something as small as that is, I mean, he's 26 now. This was when he was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
Is he going to think like that the rest of his life? Probably, because that is his ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think I'm like that, but I know there's a lot of people like that who think that's small, and that's such a small thing. So imagine someone who was beat. I have another friend, Mario, who went to school in Lancaster, which is predominantly black, and he got in fights and he was jumped by black guys until this day. I mean, this is again 10 years later, and he has a prejudice towards black people,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just, and he's convinced that's what they are
Mm-hmm.
because that's what he saw. And you can tell him, you could talk to him about Martin Luther King, you could talk to him about Malcolm X or Muhammad Ali or whatever, someone important, someone who talked about empowerment, and he would just say no, they're just violent.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in the end it's based on individual ignorance rather than
but the thing is that we don't even realize that it can be applied to the larger masses as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be about an individual.
I guess I remember
there's the authoritative personality theory, for example. That's when you prejudge others if they're not exactly like you. I think our president is a perfect example of that. He's a white male, so he's rich, and so he grew up around an environment that always indicated to him that he was, the greatest, form of a being possible. And so I feel that's where his racist behavior stems from,
Yeah.
and his prejudgment of others is because he grew up in an environment where he was always told, I'm the best, and so then that's why he thinks. So it can be based on individuals, but it can be applied to, to the larger masses as well. And I think that they marginalize ethnic minorities just because they're just a thinly veiled way to be racist. It's it sort of provides a rationale, like what you said about Mario. He was like, well, I went to school in Lancaster, I got beat up, so now I don't like black people,
Mm-hmm.
And that's categoric knowing, and it sort of provides a rationale for an irrational disposition or behavior, it's I think it's people trying to justify their prejudice, and that's that's how I feel they edge out minorities. It just provides an excuse for them to behave a certain way or think a certain way.
Or sometimes that's all they know, and that's all
Right.
they're willing to know.
Yeah, and that ties to the single story, It's just... so what about white privilege?
White privilege, I guess the idea that, I mean, when I think of white privilege, I think of a grace sticking together. So if you live in a society where white people or white men or white people are in power, if you are a white person who's maybe not in power but comes across someone in power, that person will kind of look at you almost as an equal, like, oh, he looks like me, he's like me. So that's kind of where I see the privilege, because they won't judge you, they won't prejudge you, they'll just see you and hear you out or assume you're a decent person like them. As for let's say someone white in power would see someone like us or someone of any other ethnicity, they'll already have an idea of what they're going to be like and judge who they are and assume who they are. And by that I mean police.
Yeah. That's the way it works. I mean, white privilege obviously applies to I'm sure white people do not get pulled over as much as, minorities get pulled over, but it also, I think it's bigger than that. And it can be its range is huge. It can be from something as small, we read an article by Peggy McIntosh, and she sort of listed the ways that her white privilege works for her. And the last thing on the list, and I thought it was pretty minuscule, but if you think about it, it has a huge effect on your psyche, is she said that if I go to the store, I can pick out makeup or a bandage that's equal to my color, and I'm sure that's harder for African American women. But it can be from something as small as that to something as huge as the Black Lives Matter movement, all these black men that are getting shot down by police officers, what are the odds of a white male getting, gunned down for no reason? So it has a pretty huge range. And the thing that really connected with me, and always like made me feel excluded, in elementary school, we watched a lecture by Tim Wise, and he was talking about the burden of representation. When he was in elementary, I think he said he wasn't a great student, but he never felt pressure to overachieve or overcome those obstacles because he didn't have the need to like represent his entire race. Whereas me, like, I remember a great deal of my like elementary school teachers, pretty much all my teachers were Caucasian, and I remember always wanting to be the best, like in class, not just for me and for my family, but for my race. Like I felt like I need to prove to this white man who's teaching me right now that I'm smart, so that he can think that the rest of us are that way, Like I felt that burden of representation, and it hit home for me because I never knew how to properly express it in words. But here, Tim Wise just, described it perfectly for me. And so yeah, I think all of these things that minorities experience, all these pressures, all these like their anguish that white people don't have to deal with, gives white people a huge head start in life, just because already we have this much to deal with, and they're all like already over here because they don't have to think about those things. Or he mentioned as well, like how in contemporary times, like an African American family who gets paid better than a white family, and who's better off, like they're still going to have less money in like their base fund, because if you think about it, like white Americans, they've been here for generations, and they've always been able to like collect pensions and Social Security, whereas like African Americans didn't have that luxury before, or that basic right, I should say, before. And so then even a white family of like lower income is going to have more in their base fund than an African American family who's better off, just because they've had that head start of generations, collecting for them. And so I think they marginalize ethnic minorities because, well, first of all, every advantage comes from a disadvantage. If someone's up here, then that means someone else is going to be down here. If you're reaping in rewards, that means someone else isn't getting those rewards, And so that's the way they should think about it. It's just like, well, like they shouldn't just go through life, well, yeah, I'm privileged, what am I going to do about it? Like they should, actively try to make them less so, the privileges, because
distribute the privilege.
Right. They should think of it in those terms of like every advantage comes from a disadvantage. And I think that's actually a quote from Peggy McIntosh as well. So yeah, I think that's the way it marginalizes ethnic minorities, because they have a massive head start, and it's, it's unfair. And so now I've told you a little bit about my classes, like it progressed. How do you think that it helps?
I think it would help, one, those of privilege who can probably look at themselves in the mirror and realize that they do subconsciously have a leg up. Therefore, once you can acknowledge it, I'm pretty sure they can, like we just said, like this help distribute it, or kind of maybe if they're majoring in or they're looking into politics, they can use this information to probably just be better people and just overall fair. Mm-hmm. And I think more people should probably take classes like these just for the knowledge, just for the self-awareness.
Yeah.
Whether you're in it or you're not. If you're not in it, that way you can know, maybe you've been thinking this, but you think you're crazy. You think that, or maybe you think you're just complaining, but you don't realize that, no, this is a common thing.
It's a real thing. And it's institutionalized,
that's been happening.
It's huge, the scope of it. I mean, I think did you watch 13th, or didn't you? And all about the war on drugs, how that was just a gimmick, basically, to lock
take away the to get rid of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, it's massive. It's huge. Yeah. And, well, I think it helped personally, the first unit right off the bat we read by Dr. Takaki, A Different Mirror, and it sort of laid out the different perspectives. Like it laid out the Asian American experience, the Mexican American experience, the Irish American experience of all these. He listed and described all these different, ethnic groups and how they came to the U.S. and what their experience was initially like. And I had no idea. I really had no idea about all these other minorities. I live in the Valley. I'm Mexican American, so all I ever knew was just the single story, the Pilgrims coming to the U.S. and us. Oh, we just came up north, and started picking, and so here we are. And I had no idea about all these other ethnic groups' backstories, and I think it helped me draw closer and want to know more because, for example, like we watched this thing on the United Farm Workers, and I had no idea that Filipinos and Japanese Americans were out on the fields picking with Mexican Americans, and they went through the same things and were living in the same conditions, and it made me feel a kinship to them, it made me feel closer to these ethnic groups. So I think it sort of cuts that social distance,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes me want to draw closer. And like you said, just knowledge, just knowing is already,
Mm-hmm.
a start. The social theories, like they help me be able to pinpoint like racist behavior. Now when I look at something, we watched a documentary called The Class Divided about this teacher who divided her kids into like blue-eyed and brown-eyed, and right away I was able to pinpoint all the different, the authoritarian personality theory, like the exploitation theory, all of that. I was able to just see it and identify it, and now that I know it and identify it, I can actively avoid it, or correct it if I ever see it happening. And yeah, it just I think the fact that I became aware of all these different perspectives and all these different issues going on, it made me want to know more, made me want to draw closer, and it made me empathetic, like what I said about the feeling of kinship toward, the Filipinos and Japanese Americans. Like, I think that creates a feeling of, equality, like we're both in the same place, and it makes me feel empathetic toward them. I want to lend a hand,
Mm-hmm.
Or, yeah, like white people, if they see this and they are able to identify the ways in which they're privileged, and they're able to see how ethnic minorities are underprivileged, then they're gonna want to even the scales. I feel,
Mm-hmm.
just by gaining knowledge of what their condition is like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just that it provides a base for drawing closer, and just it creates a feeling of kinship.
Mm-hmm.
It puts things into perspective and makes you want to correct them.
Mm-hmm.
I feel, because
because the first step to solving a problem is acknowledging
identifying it, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, so I think it was a huge help, and I'm really glad I took the class.